Ni hao. Good to see everyone. I'd like to start by first recognising that that image up there is a sign that if you do too much in this sector, I think Tristan alluded to this yesterday, you end up with this. And that's not great. We need to take care of ourselves. And I want to acknowledge how we've started both days with, first of all, Tai Chi. That was a beautiful start to yesterday. And this morning with Sophie Wang. And being able to bring us into a very different space. And we're in conferences like this. There's so much information. There's so much new information and ideas that we're sharing with you. So what I'd like to do to help us move from the last session into this session is to take 30 seconds of silence. And I have a beautiful bell. It's a bell called a shurong that it'll start with the bell and it'll be 30 seconds. And just take some time. Close your eyes and take 30 seconds. Our time starts now. Thank you. I'm from Melbourne in Australia. One of the things that we do whenever we have gatherings in Australia is that we acknowledge the land that we're on and we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. And so I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land here, the Taiwanese Aboriginal peoples, and pay respect to them. I think that's important as we start to think about social value and understanding what needs to change in some of the different communities that we need to acknowledge. We need to be able to reconcile the past and be able to think about what's best to be able to support communities to grow and develop and to thrive, which is central to what we do in Social Value International around the world. The topic of what we're looking at here today is around civil society organisations, social enterprises and charities, and how we can co-create together the changes that are required to be able to meet a lot of the different goals that we've described and to be able to develop better value for communities across the world. What's central to a lot of this is that it's a power shift. We've got to acknowledge the power. We just heard about the philanthropic sector. And what's clear about philanthropy is that there is an implicit power relationship at play. When money is being spent in communities, we need to acknowledge there is power at play. And part of what we need to explore is how control can be given back to Indigenous communities. And this is not just a nice idea. There's some pretty significant things taking place around the world. I want to share one thing with you before I introduce our incredible keynote speaker. The one thing that's taking place is in Western Australia, in the southwest of Western Australia. And it's the Noongar people, the traditional owners of the land there. And they're about to pursue a claim against the government for $290 billion, that's 200 billion US, to compensate for the spiritual damage caused by the loss of their traditional lands. Now, this has been building for a long time, and there is a good calculation behind that. But what we have here is an example of understanding and appreciation the value of culture and being able to understand where control might need to go back to. So it's just wanted to give you that as an example of this isn't something that's interesting and theoretical. This is real. This is about people's lives and about Indigenous communities. And we are very lucky to have an incredible leader of Māori communities here today. Awerangi Tamihere I had to ask her what is her role. She said, I am the chief bottle washer for my family. More accurately, she holds multiple different roles, and she's been able to And she's been able to support and lead Te Whānau o Waiperera and the Whānau Ora Commission Agency, currently as the Chief Operating Officer, and renowned as a leader across New Zealand, Aotearoa. So I'd like to introduce Awerangi Tamihere to the stage to be able to provide the keynote speech for this topic. Good luck.
Thank you. I ngā mana, I ngā reo, I ngā karangatanga maha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ki te tangata whenua o te whenua o Taiwana, nā mihi kauanuanu ki a koutou. O tī rā, tēnei hoki te mihi atu ki a koutou. Ngā pau mō ngā moimoia o ngā tangata katoa. Ni hao. Greetings on behalf of the peoples of New Zealand, Aotearoa. We acknowledge the peoples of this land. We acknowledge your faith. We acknowledge your spirituality and your connection to your own land. We also acknowledge your ancestors and the sacrifices they have made to your future generations of your country. Also, to everyone here, thank you for being here. Being here so that we can all understand a little bit more before we leave about each of the roles we play in the area of social impact. Because it is only by coming together this today and yesterday and listening to everyone's journeys do we actually start to understand the contribution we all make to the greater social impact of improving this world together. So today I'm going to share with you from the land down under, New Zealand, a story about how New Zealand is looking at dealing with some complex challenges facing it. And what does that mean from the perspective of the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand? The name of the Indigenous peoples in this country being called Māori. The first thing is that we must address there is an urgency for change, as I've heard through so many presentations over the last day and a half. There are complex problems which we're all trying to grapple with that require multiple solutions. The first is that in the mid-2000s, there's some confronting challenges that are facing the state in New Zealand. There is a widening gap and increasing disparities between the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand, Māori, relative to the non-Indigenous peoples of New Zealand, non-Māori. Not only that, the state delivery model in New Zealand is actually based on the industrial age. It identifies the issues, identifies a policy solution, it develops service specifications to meet those issues, and it delivers the program to the people. But it is focused on fixing the problem rather than enabling well-being. It's focused on a top-down approach rather than a bottom-up approach. It's about focus on doing it to the people rather than with the people, by the people. And not only that, it operates in silos. Health, social services, education and justice are all delivered separately, as though each of our people all lead those lives in very separate ways. Those are some of the significant issues facing the state at the moment. But in parallel to that, in the mid-2000s, Māori providers began to emerge from the late 1990s to start to deliver to their own communities. We're now starting to see competency and capability as providers of services, which we'd never seen before in the early 1990s and before. We're now starting to see new approaches emerging to address issues facing Māori. We're also starting to see the emergence of aspirational approaches that begin to form the basis of a sustained well-being outcomes within the Indigenous Māori community. So what does that mean? In 2013, this urgency, the issues facing Māori peoples, the capacity that was starting to develop within own Māori organisations, there was a recognition by the government that the issues facing Māori are complex and require multiple solutions if we're able to achieve change in these communities. That meant, as well as the traditional government model of funding services, there needed to be a different approach. One approach is called the whānau ora, which is a Māori word that I'll use a lot, which means family well-being. A commissioning agency that was established in 2014, which I'm here to talk about today. It was as a direct result of devolution from government. The Ministry for Māori Development funded 3 new commissioning agencies across New Zealand that were not owned by the government. They were actually owned by Māori tribal entities and Māori organisations to put in place a very different system to achieve the outcomes that matter for Māori in their communities. So we're now starting to talk about making the shift from deprivation to aspiration. At the heart of this new commissioning approach is the belief that achieving outcomes for and with whānau, families, are much more likely to be sustained in the long term when outcomes that have been identified directly by the whānau, the family, so that the whānau are well placed to have a strong sense of ownership of the outcomes and the resulting transformation for them and their whānau. And that underpins the absolute end impact that this commissioning for outcomes model is looking with these Indigenous peoples. So, from languishing to flourishing, there's also something quite significant that underpins this change process with these families that is important if you're going to really make the shift in these communities which have high deprivational status. If we're going to make generational change, we must be able to have families who are constantly in crisis to start to move to be averting crisis. Those same families, once they're averting crisis, we must start to support them reach a level of stability. From stability, we start to see these families over time strengthen their resilience. From strengthening their resilience, we start to see their own families taking responsibility for the leadership of their own families. Once you have families doing the leadership of their own directions, those families actually start to step up and become the community pillars, the community leaders to support their own communities. This is what we call a generational approach for families from languishing to flourishing. For some of our families who have done this, who've been in this deprivational process for at least 2 to 3 generations, it can take 25 years, 1 generation, to enable this change. Other families are obviously all at shorter periods of time. So, while we've talked about the commissioning for outcomes model, what I want to share with you is the Māori worldview model, which is called whānau ora. Whānau ora means family well-being. You are only well if your mind, your spirit, your physical body, but also your family are well. If you address all of those elements, then you truly have a sense of well-being that we can look at. So this approach in the commissioning agency builds on the strength and capabilities of families. It does not focus on what's wrong with them and what isn't right. It's an aspirational approach. It's about families creating their own definition of success, encouraging them to develop solutions and build capacity and resilience to become self-managing. Specialist staff who act as outcomes navigators and advocates for whānau. They sit down with families and ask them what outcomes do they want to achieve and how do we navigate them across health, social services, education and justice to achieve the outcomes they want. Whānau often have complex needs and specialist navigators are also there to assist them in accessing integrated support. When obstacles stand in their way, they are supported to move from crisis to planning for their future. Now, the commissioning for outcomes model, aligning the theory to practice. Just a context, 77% of New Zealand's population live in the North Island. 90% of Māori live in the North Island. The commissioning agency that I'm talking about there were 3 of them. The one that I'm involved in is responsible for commissioning in the North Island. We were having to respond to a very diverse population who live in highly remote areas, to Māori populations who live in the cities who no longer have the identity anymore that they used to have when they lived in the country areas where they're tribally from. 1,083 communities of Māori deprivation are in the North Island compared to 108 in the South Island. The commissioning agency model, we have 6 regions across the North Island. We have 15 regional partner hubs, of which we have 81 whānau order partners. That means we have 81, often you've heard the word not-for-profit organisations, we call them for-purpose organisations. So we have 81 Māori for-purpose organisations who deliver this program to families. There's about 10,500 families, of which in those families there's a total of 25,000 members. The ground-up ecosystem. What do we do when we measure the change that matters? The thing for us is that we're about managing 2 outcomes. It's about managing an outcomes program. There's a huge systemic to be put in place if you're going to look at reporting against outcomes. The first thing for us was to look at the design and implementation of outcome measurement programs. But at the same time, I've heard the word capability come up a lot. We have to work alongside our whānau order partners, our for-purpose organisations, to help develop their own outcomes frameworks. It's one thing for us to develop an outcomes framework, but if the very organisations on the ground that work with those communities they live in do not have their own, then who are we to put our own on top of them? They are the ones on the ground. They are accountable to the families for the outcomes. It is them first that must develop their own outcomes framework. Then they can align with a subset of the outcomes they collect, comes up to the commissioning agency. Not only that, we are then supporting some of our whānau order partners who have been in this process for a number of years now, actually are becoming the thought leaders in New Zealand for outcomes measurement, and some of them have moved from outcomes measurement to actually looking further at social impact and SROI. So when we talk about a wellbeing framework for outcomes, this was a consultation process with many of our whānau order partners and also included the communities on the ground. So when we talk about wellbeing, we have these as our outcome domains: whānau participation in the community, whānau relationships, whānau standards of living, whānau engagement in the Māori world, whānau health, and whānau knowledge. These are our overall outcomes domains where we measure the progress of outcomes of our families. In the middle, whānau order, which, as I said before, is whānau wellbeing. As an example, underneath that you have a subset of outcomes. So, for example, whānau knowledge includes outcomes that relate to education and training, financial literacy, budgeting, health literacy, ICT literacy, numeracy and literacy, skills, knowledge for employment. So they're just examples of other outcomes that sit within those overall outcome domains. We also have our own on-time outcomes measurement system that we developed called whānau tahi, so that we're able at any time to go live to look at the outcomes that are actually being implemented on the ground by our families and track how those outcomes are being measured. It is also a integrated capabilities and tool so that our whānau partners can use it as their own navigator tool for outcomes, dashboards and reporting, but it's also just recently been internationally accredited by Social Value International, and it also is accredited by 3 other organisations who we work with in partnership on that program. That outcomes management system is used by all of our partners, which means we're able to take a collective approach to how we look at outcomes measurement and reporting across the whole ecosystem of 81 whānau order partners. Not only that, in 2014, this is when our organisation first came into being, we looked first of all at developing an outcomes framework. That led to a next milestone where we actually developed an outcomes roadmap. It's one thing having an outcomes framework, it's another thing putting a roadmap in place for the commissioning agency, for the partners on the ground, so we can all work to develop our capability, capacity and skills in that outcomes framework and roadmap. 2017 saw us actually take the next step in social investment, social return on investment, and I'm going to talk about that shortly, and that is that we support some of our partners who are in that process now of doing SRIs. And just recently, we just launched our Measuring Impact for Whānau Wellbeing. We've now moved from looking at outcomes just for families to actually start to look at the broader picture of how we measure impact and wellbeing. Outcomes framework, outcomes roadmap, and measuring impact. But I'm going to stop here because I've talked about thought leaders and whānau partners. And 2 years ago, one of our whānau partners had released their first SRI report. It was huge for us in New Zealand. Not many SRI reports have been released in New Zealand yet, but this was the very first Indigenous SRI. So we had to take account of different things. How do we account for our culture? How do we even put a value on culture? Not only that, while it's a report, it must be more meaningful than just a report that's done. How do we use the information in that report to better inform and make decisions on the impact that we are achieving? Not only that, this is a process here to show you that this is digital storytelling. The report just does not get left behind in a wardrobe somewhere or in a back office shelf. We have a filmmaking unit that brings these stories to life. So I want to share with you very quickly an 8-minute video that shares the story of change for these families. But not only that, it shares our journey as our first SRI about what does that mean for Indigenous peoples. We're to use a lot of Māori leaders to help us be involved in this SRI. And I particularly want to thank Simon in his capacity with Social Ventures Australia, who are partner with us in looking at a different approach to how we do an SRI with our Indigenous peoples. And we'll share that video now.
I was getting bullied a lot, and hold on.
I got a phone call and it was the worst phone call I could ever expect. If it wasn't for that program, she could have ended up somewhere really dark.
So the program was set up to support our rangatahi aged between 10 and 13 who had parents who may be experiencing mental health, or whether they were being exposed to any sort of drug intake in the whānau home, and it was around supporting and making them resilient. So 180 tautamariki came through the program over a 3-year period, and I think the magic ingredients for us would have been our two kaimahi, Fenda and Jana.
A lot of the kids that we worked with had maybe some trouble with bullying at school, and were not so confident to stick up for themselves.
I felt that I could talk to Jana and Fenda when I couldn't talk to my family or my parents.
We got a lot of parents liking this movement because we were quite informal, which is that Waiparero way. We have a thing called the Mataora snapshot, and that identifies what they are interested in. Once they do bring it up, we ask them, why are you not doing this thing? And they might say something like financial problems. Well, that's where Tautamariki was able to step in. Say, for example, rugby. Yeah, we'll get them into rugby team. That'll take their Tuesday and Thursdays up, after school. Then we only got Monday, Wednesday, Friday to think about.
The whānau approach is a much more collaborative approach between the funder, the provider, and most of all, the family. The family and the service meet and agree on what the aspirations of the family are and how outcomes for those aspirations might be measured.
The Tai Tamariki program is funded by the Ministry of Health. They were very interested in looking at what the extra value was of a program like that if it was to be funded on an ongoing basis. So an SRI was a really good tool for us that could clearly document the change that really mattered to families, that is not captured in traditional reporting requirements to funders.
Social return on investment is just one trackability framework that goes to funders to ensure that they're happy that the funds have been expensed appropriately. We have to account for the dollars we expense. But most importantly, we've got to account to our people. We did that with this Tamihere program, and it's the first one that was released in Parliament ever in New Zealand's history. It actually affirmed a lot of things that we're doing and evidenced it in a very good way.
I am yours, you are mine. We're making a...
What we're able to capture with this SRI is truly what is the change that happens for those families, and what is the value that our organisation contributes to that change, which has never been able to be articulated before.
They would write their feelings down, then they'd turn that into a song. They'd have the strength to get up and sing it, and they'd be that safe that they'd put it on their social media platform. So that in itself shows how effective it was for our youth and their confidence.
A lot of them have become champions in sports. A lot of the kids have leadership roles within their schools, so deputy head girls and head boys.
You know, to see them when they walk in the program to begin with, and they might have a chip on their shoulder, they may have low confidence, they can't look you in the eye, and to come back and see them months later and be able to be proud of who they are.
It really helped you to deal with your emotions, how to engage with other people, and how to deal with different personalities.
The value of culture was a particular priority for us in this SRI, to ensure that when we put a value on it, it was done through the lens that was appropriate to us as a Māori organisation.
Very little attention currently is paid towards the role of culture in terms of promoting positive outcome. Waiparaira does an incredible job in terms of engaging people early through the use of culture, and the benefits of that are difficult to quantify. Certainly in the long run it reduces cost. More importantly, it plays a critical role in ensuring that health outcomes are maximised, and that's what contributes to more enduring change.
This study has shown that a good mental health outcome is strongly linked to cultural development, and cultural development not only is about the acquisition of cultural knowledge, but also about a way of life.
And if you can get them strong in their culture, then that just grows them from there as young individuals and our future leaders.
Culture is not one part of what we contribute to the change, it underpins the whole change.
Because of this program, it's really made me think more about my culture, so I've started a te reo course at Unitec. I'm always thankful to Jana for her help.
How do you build the relationship of trust with a very hard community sometimes that don't trust any agency? How not only do you build the trust, but keep that trust going and take it to the next step so they build their self-confidence? How then do you take it the next step and build their self-confidence where they start to take ownership of their own journey? How then do you transfer the magic of their own journey to then shaping the journey of themselves and their families? That is what's never captured. That is actually the extra added value of Waiparaira, and that is what we've been able to articulate through the SRI.
Tonight is kind of like an awards night, and it's the red carpet event, and we premiere our movies.
She's definitely a lot more confident and more sure of herself and what she can do, rather than being worried that she can't do it.
I'm going to carry on. I note I have 53 seconds left to finish my presentation. I might go over Simon just a couple of minutes, but I will whip through these slides. But rather than me talking forever about SRI and what it means, the best way is actually hear it from the voices that count on the ground, from the families, from the communities, and those who are all in our organisations that contribute to the SROI. So just very quickly, the commissioning engine room, building on that momentum. We have 5 different investment programs. They start at one step, funding a moment that matters, so it's a $1,000 grant for a family that needs a moment within 24 hours, 48 hours funded, right through to some short-term, medium-term programs, and then through to longer-term family leadership programs. The investment programs are very broad frameworks. We don't specify the services at all, and they're given to the partners on the ground who then determine for themselves how they'll use those investment packages to make it work for the families, and it makes sense from the family's point of view and the outcomes they want to achieve. Just very quickly, building partner capacity of 81 partners is very important. We have what's called a school of change, where we do outcomes measurement. Outcomes management is huge in our communities. Knowing just how to write the outcome statement of what the change is for the families, let alone reporting on outcomes, makes a key part of what we do. We have backbone, so we have data analysts, change management leads, and regional project managers that support a cluster of partners across the North Island. We also have a fine order accreditation program for the organisations who think in this way and follow the principles of SRI. And we're very fortunate that just last year this was accredited by Social Value International, so it's actually an internationally accredited program. We're also looking at the same thing now to do it with our individual practitioners in our workforce. We also have a backbone group, so we have Social Innovation Hub, Outcomes Measurement Team, Data and Performance, Relationship Management and Workforce. We're very interested in the area of social impact, specialist capability, and we're so proud because in our team we have Dr. Sneha Lakotia, and she's become our very first New Zealand NZ SRI accredited practitioner this year. So that's a big, huge plus for us that we're able to look at developing our own capability and capacity here in New Zealand. We also took a role, so we actually helped support the development of the New Zealand Network for Social Impact. It wasn't just about delivering services, it was looking up and out at who else was in that space across New Zealand. It's still a very new space for New Zealand, but we wanted to link outside what we're doing. The disruptors, you need a new mindset, a new model and a new approach. Just through here quickly, I've already mentioned it, but these go through the differences between a traditional government approach to funding versus a commissioning for outcomes approach to funding. And I really want to just leave you with a social impact blueprint. That, in summary, what makes this work? There's a common shared agenda across the whole of the 81 partners about wellbeing. Not only that, there's an agreed shared outcomes measurement program towards that common shared agenda. There's a backbone support infrastructure to foster cross-sector communication, alignment and collaboration to achieve this population systemic change. Social impact is now wired into our DNA. Social impact is no longer just a tool, a service, an assured SRI report, or even a research program. Social impact has now become a movement within our communities for evidencing the change that matters most for our families, for our communities. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.